60s weren't great times. Hippies, everything was peace and love. It's really, from what I told, my parents say it was really troubling.
Kill the pigs! Suck their blood! Kill the pigs!
Oh, I know nothing about it. Oh, no, I do that. Didn't they used to have riots here?
Fuck you, you freaky looking bastard! Get out of our town! Go!
I think people started to get fed up with a society that's providing them experiences that aren't really satisfying.
Mass rebellion against the institution.
I think a lot of them could be yuppies. I mean, they don't have that deep social consciousness anymore. They can't. I mean, it's the 80s now.
So they're probably thinking about the same things. Maybe not as radical, but still have the same ideas.
Look at students now, they're so politically apathetic. Most of them don't even vote.
All right.
I like political apathy, it's easier.
Oh, I am just a student, sir, and only want to learn. But it's hard to read through the rising smoke from the books that you like to burn. So I'd like to make a promise, and I'd like to make a vow that when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
This is Isla Vista today, the student community adjacent to the University of California at Santa Barbara. This 1 square mile community is reported to be one of the most densely populated areas west of the Mississippi. This rebuilt structure, formerly the Bank of America, is now a dance club. But on the night of February 25th, 1970, it was burned to the ground.
Everywhere I hear the sound of Martin George Floyd.
Compared to the attitudes and political beliefs of students today, the idealism, hope, and anger of the Isla Vista Rebellion in 1970 seems like an eternity ago, a present disconnected from its past. Popular media stereotypes tell us that the former 60s radicals have sold out their social conscience and political commitment in pursuit of careers and wealth.
I don't know, I'd hate to think that it was all just fashion.
What?
Our commitment.
It wasn't. We accomplished things.
All evidence to the contrary.
Now you're just taking a position.
Sometimes I think I've put that time down, pretended it wasn't real, just so I can live with how I am now. You know what I mean?
Nobody knows for certain how much or how little truth there is in that judgment, but it does not seem to hold up in the case of the student activists whose careers were followed in this documentary.
Change. It was a suck-bag world I was brought up in. I mean, we had this shithole suburban Cold War life that didn't really appeal to my generation. Much of my generation, and it was a breaking out.
The ideals that we'd hoped for and lived for and believed in somehow were being subverted by this corporate capitalistic greed that really encouraged the war for profits.
There's an attempt and a thought on a number of us that we can actually transform American society, that the revolution was at hand.
18 years after the burning of the bank, former UCSB student activists were reunited for a panel discussion.
I think we had a sense that we could do almost anything we wanted to do as far as work was concerned, and so we didn't want to do the kind of work that our parents had done or that they had groomed us to do. We wanted to make revolution.
I don't think many of us were thinking about buying a 4-bedroom house in 10 years or the BMW, or even thinking maybe about how many kids we were going to have. Because the future seemed to represent change, major dramatic change, and we weren't quite sure exactly what that meant, but it meant something very different than what we'd known as teenagers.
Changing the university, at least immediately changing the university so that university is more sensitive to the needs of the Hispanic population.
When your friends and the sons and daughters of, older generation folks that you know are being carted off to war and coming home in boxes.
There's a change in the wind and a split in the road. You can do what's right, or you can do what you are told. And the prize of the victory will belong to the bold. For these are the days of decision. Yes,
By the late 1960s, the student movement had evolved from an organized, reform-minded movement to a disorganized, anger-filled mass anti-war movement. From 1968 to 1970, UCSB would be transformed from a lazy seaside party school to a highly politicized campus.
I date October 14th, 1968 as the day I consciously take up political struggle, and I've been involved in the people's struggle ever since. So I date, it's been 20 years that I've continued work. And it's from this incident. So my involvement is I've worked with the BSU and I've gone to events, but I wasn't in on planning it, but I'm on my way to class at 10 o'clock in the morning and walk by North Hall, which is occupied, and have quite a long discussion with myself about who I am, what I feel, where do I really stand, and it was based on that little discussion I had with myself that I went into the building. I feel like I've been in the building ever since. I think it was the correct decision. I'm very happy I did that.
The efforts of the black students were subsequently successful in creating a black studies department and minority recruitment programs. White students were shocked and impressed by the black students' courage and commitment to a political cause. Within months, the United Front, a coalition of black, white, and Chicano student groups, had taken up campus issues.
People were rising up and demanding changes in lots of different sectors of society. Blacks were rising up, women were rising up, students were rising up for student rights, and all these kind of movements were kind of converging in this kind of swirling thing that became what we thought was going to be a revolutionary movement. And it turned out not to be in the long run, but for a while it sure felt like it was.
I went through the phone directory myself and looked at all the Garcias and all the Martinez, and I called every Hispanic surname that I found in the phone directory, student directory, and invited them to the first meeting.
I was involved in the first Women's Studies course at UCSB. It was a totally new experience for all of us. We really didn't know what books to read. We didn't even know what women authors were out there to look for.
Come in now alone. No, goddamn it! I just told you no. Well, he won't accept it.
By the winter of 1970, tension on campus was extremely high. Bill Allen, a popular anthropology professor, was denied tenure on what students charged were his radical political beliefs and his permissive lifestyle. Nearly 8,000 students, more than half the student body, signed a petition asking for an open hearing, but the administration flatly denied the request. Students staged a nonviolent sit-in and rally. For the first time, police were brought on campus.
Hey, you don't have to club anybody.
No, I'm innocent of everything that I've not been accused of.
What were you accused of?
I was accused of which time?
The time that you were convicted.
Oh, which time?
Okay, give me it.
The time I went to the prison?
Yeah.
I was convicted, there was a street fight right out here. I was convicted of battery on a police officer and you know, inciting to riot and all that kind of stuff.
So your brother's bound and gagged, and they've chained him to a chair. Won't you please come to Chicago just to sing?
Where the brutality of the ruling class was illustrated.
2 weeks after the Bill Allen demonstrations, on February 25, 1970, William Kunstler having recently completed his defense of the Chicago Eight, tried for conspiring to disrupt the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, gave a powerful speech in Santa Barbara.
The trouble is, it doesn't get through. Therefore, you have to fill the streets so they can see you.
Following the speech, students walked back to Isla Vista in a supercharged state. The police, expecting trouble, were patrolling the streets in full riot gear. One student, holding a bottle of wine, was beaten and arrested in view of many students. The police had mistaken his wine bottle for a Molotov cocktail.
Get a rock! Get the fuck out of here, you ugly looking freak! Leave us alone!
An angry crowd gathered and began throwing rocks at the police.
And about 5 hours later, there were 300 police battling out with students in the street, and the students won.
Every apartment you walk into in Isla Vista has yellow pens from the Bank of America in them. Every one.
The targets were specific targets of student oppression in Isla Vista. There were county sheriff's cars that were stoned. It was the real estate offices that had their windows broken in. It was the Bank of America.
I think also I'd like to say, and I was very happy to learn of the students from the campus out here who participated on the other side, who helped law enforcement, who tried to protect property, who brought fire extinguishers and tried to put out some of the fires. And I think this is far more typical of the student body than of the cowardly little bums that have been doing what the others have been doing.
No person, except a law enforcement officer or member of the National Guard, shall carry any firearm or other deadly weapon.
During the next 90 days, 2 more riots followed. The police clamped down, becoming increasingly violent, and eventually imposed a dusk-to-dawn curfew.
I got things out of this riot song. Out of this riot song.
At a certain point, all of this optimism in just the space of a few months turned to a real sense of despair. I, at that time, purchased an old World War II rifle, an M1, and actually I began to fear for my life.
No one in their right mind really wants to have a shootout with any group of police behind anything, but that's what I had been trained to do at that point.
It was almost a scene out of an old Western where you're going to go down fighting.
We seriously thought they were going to bust down the door and that there would be a shootout and that hopefully some of them would die in the process. And if necessary, we were prepared to die.
We were so crazy.
The revolution has come at last, but whatever it is, it sure is happening fast. I got
The punchline to the story is when all the cops surrounded the house and they ran up the stairs, they realized they were at the wrong house and went down the stairs and went to another house which was right behind ours and arrested 2 people there for breaking curfew, and they weren't even coming after us.
By the end of the 1970 school year, over 1,000 people had been arrested, and 1 student was dead. Tear gas had seeped into almost everyone's apartments. Helicopters had hovered over everyone's heads. Dusk-to-dawn curfews defined parameters of every resident's life, and the troops patrolled the streets. The war, at least for a while, had come home, as did anxiety over what might happen next. The following school year, there were no massive confrontations as there had been the previous year, despite the growing polarization between activists and the authorities, and the anger over the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, there were moves to quell activism. The Nixon administration had been effective in scaring people with counterintelligence. The draft lottery was halted, and the voting age lowered to 18. Lacking confidence and distrustful of the America they were growing up in, the future was not about a personal career, but as an activist making social change.
For example, you could live well and sort of hold your political principles intact. For example, I worked as a legal worker at a law collective. We all were paid by what we needed. And that meant what our rent would cost, our insurance was taken care of. We didn't need much, and in that way we could sort of exist without having to worry too much about the future.
I felt I really didn't have the personal resources to confront all the events that were happening, and so I began to look for to broaden the ideological base, to use the terminology that we used back then, but to get a larger horizon with which to interpret these events and to place my life within. And so I began a very in-depth spiritual search.
Soon after graduating, Costello de la Rocha enrolled in law school.
I saw that there may be their way of being able to work within the context of the law and using the law to be able to bring changes and creating a more humane and equal and more just society.
An unbelievably strong desire to be alone, to be tranquil, to be calm, to be away from all that had preceded me in the previous 2 or 3 years and included the demonstrations.
During the Isla Vista riots of 1970, Mick was convicted and sentenced to 3 months in prison for striking a police officer.
I didn't want to put it behind me, like divorce myself from it politically. I wanted to not live that way. And so while I was teaching this class, I was living on the bait receiver down at the harbor down here where the all-day boats come up and the guy scoops the bait, and I was that guy, and I lived in this little shack with a heat lamp and a hot plate and my guitar. I mean, I wanted to get I was like a hippie. I mean, I think I still had pretty long hair. I can't really remember. Yeah, I did have really. In fact, I swore I wouldn't cut my hair ever again when I got out of Chino. I'm glad I changed that political stance. But I wanted to get away from it, and that's where I started. That's where I first touched base with what turned out to be 12 years in commercial and sport fishing.
By the early 70s, the demand of students to end the war was at last taken up by mainstream politics.
Call it peace or call it treason, call it love or call it reason, but I ain't marching anymore. No, I ain't marching anymore.
The majority of Americans had finally turned against the war. The mass student movement began to splinter into Marxist sects.
We were revolutionaries in the United States, and there wasn't about to be a revolution. And that was in 1970 of what we've been talking about. In 1971, I had a chance to go to Cuba twice that year. I come out of Cuba the second time. I'm very clear what I'm about, that I really do believe in this revolution stuff, and clearly we had not taken it up right in the United States. From the political and ideological point of view, that was the main lesson for me.
Cuba also showed you that this popular American notion that it's all right to be a revolutionary and idealist when you're a young person, but if you're going to be serious when you're an adult, you have to give that up. It's not true.
There seemed to be no middle ground at some point between kind of a sellout liberal politics as we saw it at that time, of just focusing on changing the system from within, of electoral politics basically, versus much more serious revolutionary struggle that involved becoming a Marxist and accepting the necessity for armed struggle.
In 1971, after returning from a trip to Vietnam and spending 45 days in jail for involvement in an anti-war protest, Becca Wilson and some friends founded a weekly newspaper in the city of Santa Barbara.
I saw the work I was doing on the newspaper as part of building a revolutionary movement. Now it seems kind of silly that we thought of ourselves as making a revolution, because we were really so far from it. But I think that actually working on the News and Review was one of the things that taught me that.
The News and Review was a success and became the longest-running staff-owned weekly paper in the country until it was sold in 1984. By the middle 70s, however, the communal bonding and selfless commitment to the movement had faded.
Some of them were dreamers, some of them were fools, who were making plans and thinking of the future.
I also began to see that the Eastern religions, the yoga and everything was, I won't say a fad, but more of a fringe sort of phenomena. and that indeed I was an American. I was a middle class, born and bred, and I did not want to be on the fringe anymore. I gradually drifted back to the church and stuck with it to the point of becoming, started going to seminary and then becoming a Lutheran pastor.
I started to also feel that it was more important to me to think about, wait a minute, if there's not going to be a revolution, what does that mean for my life? How am I going to live my life?
I found myself thinking a lot about it, but not coming up with answers. And ultimately, what I did do was apply to law school.
And so I started thinking much more in terms of how do I want to make a living that's a good living and do work that's meaningful to me and that maybe isn't revolutionary, but will certainly help to move things a little bit.
Becca returned to school, earned a master's degree in film, and now works in the television industry. Her most recent work is a documentary entitled Voices from the Pen. The film is about a poetry workshop in a women's prison. Joanne did not lose sight of her original goals to help the underprivileged, and today works as a public interest lawyer advising clients in work-related discrimination cases.
My job is, in essence, my political work. One of the reasons I went to law school is to get the tools to be a political person who can also help folks.
The question of how did we reconcile our politics vis-a-vis our careers, the answer is no. I happen to be a school teacher. I think that requires some social responsibility and awareness, but that's not the main way in which I try to express my political conviction is through my job. The main way I express my political conviction is through participating as a Marxist-Leninist in organized political activity, primarily with the Marxist-Leninist newspaper Frontline.
By the mid-'80s, the story of the 60s activists as retold in popular culture was that hippies sold out their intense commitment and values to become the epitome of that which they had struggled against. At UCSB, Professor Richard Flax, one of the founders of the Students for a Democratic Society, has been studying the effects of the 1960s student movement on the individuals who were involved in it.
Jerry Rubin was a good story because he fit this conventional wisdom to a T. He was almost a caricature of it. I mean, here's this guy who portrayed himself as a revolutionary in the late 60s who ends up as a stockbroker. Actually, I think in the last couple of years, he hasn't been continued to be that kind of focus. But I think that when people think about the 60s activist, his image comes to mind.
But the actual lives of our 60s radicals tells a different story.
The research we did, and also research that other people have done, which indicates that most of the people who were activists in the 60s have been trying in some way to maintain the values, the moral principles, the perspectives that they were coming to feel when they were students.
And what we're attempting to do is combine the efforts of the corporation and move it towards and develop an institution in that community that is run by and to service the Hispanic or the Latino population.
In the late 70s, Costello de la Rocha returned to his hometown of East Los Angeles and became executive director of the East LA Barrio Free Clinic, a low-cost health clinic serving the Hispanic population.
We want to be essentially to develop a model program that is capable of delivering quality care, capable of providing it at a low cost, and capable of continuing to grow and serve as a model for other Hispanics who are interested in the health industry.
Today, the Barrio Free Clinic has evolved to become Altamed Health Services, a multi-million-dollar non-profit corporation operating 3 clinics. In the early 80s, Mick Kronman suffered a kidney failure and was forced into less strenuous work. Since then, he's started a new career as a consultant to Santa Barbara County in oil fisheries relations and as a freelance journalist.
And to me, if I can produce a story that is based in truth that tells my readers about an issue in a way that they haven't learned before, which is really something that I hadn't learned before either, that we're all sharing at the same time. That is how I am carrying on the political struggle, as it were.
While many former student radicals have been struggling with ways to balance their values and commitments with a meaningful career, the world has changed dramatically. The dissident voices warning of ecological destruction, governmental corruption, and lack of hope in the 60s and early 70s have now become mainstream realities. But progressive activism has decreased. The issues that appeared simple in the 60s have turned out to be very complex and immobilizing in the absence of a social movement. And the further tightening of the economy requires a pragmatism in pursuing one's personal financial future that was not as strong in the 60s and early 70s.
So a number of our friends from the 60s who didn't have the chances to maintain their revolutionary fervor, time will come again. Time will come again. There was a flow in the 30s. 30 years later, there was a flow in the 60s.
Who knows?
Who knows?
Right.
Who knows? Some of us are working madly toward it.
Bring it back. And we'll respect our elders just as long as they allow that. When I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now. I've read of other countries where the students take a stand. They've even helped to overthrow the leaders of the land. Now I wouldn't go so far to say we're also learning how, but when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now. So keep right on a-talking and tell us what to do. But if nobody listens, my apologies to you. And I know that you are younger ones, 'cause you sure are older now. And when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now. So I'm just a student, sir, and only want to learn. But it's hard to read through the rising smoke from the books that you like to burn. So I'd like to make a promise, and I'd like to make a vow, that when I've got something to say, sir, I'm gonna say it now.
I was standing right across the street with a bag of marshmallows and a coat hanger, watching the bank burn.
Bag of marshmallows and a coat hanger?
I thought, well, as long as we got this blaze, might as well toast these mellows, you know. It's funny, you know. It landed in the paper the next morning, like, well, picture of a guy going, Yeah.
So you were there, huh?
Oh yeah, I was standing right across. You could feel the heat from across the street. You know, you couldn't even get any closer to that. You know, it's wow, intense heat.